International buzzwords for rescuing Ukraine's economy are well known: reforms, austerity, foreign direct investment, FDI. But what if that international consensus is wrong and austerity actually prevents Ukraine from receiving foreign direct investment? We are joined by Balazs Jarabik, non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and excellent expert on Eastern Europe, Central Europe and Ukraine. So, Balazs, we
Thank
just
you.
watched this interview with the representative of IMF in Ukraine, but in a speaking broadly, should we consider any alternative approach to reinvigorating Ukrainian economies?
Well, thanks for having me, Natalka. Always very good to be here. And this is a very, not just interesting, but a heavy topic. First of all, because I'm not an economist, I'm more researching this or viewing this from transition research. You know, I'm from Central Europe myself and dealing with Ukraine the past 15 years. I think one of the things is what we see, the conflict between the Western institutions and Ukraine can be summarized very simple. The Western institutions trying to do sometimes quite dogmatic policy prescriptions, as we heard. At the same time, the Ukrainian government wants to be re-elected. And the word elections we haven't heard in the interview, for example, which is the actual political situation in Ukraine. Now, that being said, the second thing is that we have been seeing grow, but we have been seeing very modest growth, particularly toward the recession, which was 15% in 2014. And I'm among those scholars who are thinking that the actual prescription was a bit too dogmatic and was not tied to the Ukrainian actual political situation. The prescription was austerity, you know, macroeconomic stability, which is terribly important for Ukraine. At the same time, was also calculating with increased FDI, foreign direct investment, which was not actually happening. Now, what is the problem with the austerity is not only making sure that there is macroeconomic stability, but also reduced very heavily, according to state statistics, the state investment. Now, investment are coming from the banks, coming from the state, and coming from the FDI. And if there is no FDI and the banking sector is still very weak and fragile, it is the role of the state which should be forthcoming, and that's exactly what the Western policy prescriptions killed.
So where will the state will take money then, especially when we're speaking about getting the foreign direct investment into Ukraine? Of course, we heard that, of course, the rule of law is the issue, but of course, and as well, the war is an issue, and
right.
That's how it's seen.
Yes, and here I agree with the IMF otherwise neat assessment that unfortunately the institutions, the rule of law, the corruption, the still ongoing corruption, these are serious obstacles towards state investment as well. But again, the Western policy prescriptions were also a heavy obstacle. And one of the crucial things is that the IMF, this is the 7th IMF program vis-a-vis Ukraine in the past 20 years. Now 6 has been failed. And, you know, we can blame Ukraine a lot for that, but I think if there is 6 programs, the actual lessons learned from why these 6 programs have failed should be taken into account. And what the IMF is now saying, and the Western institutions are saying, rule of law, corruption, and all this, it is not something new, and we should know that it takes time. So what is the alternative? And here comes, I think it should be the state and the austerity for particularly, and you know, like let's name it as it is. Austerity is a concept which have been a failure in the European Union as well. And provided, you know, it's a German concept and was forced to the EU, and now there is quite open economic and even star economists are saying that this has been a mistake, which was actually limited growth within the European Union. So the question is whether we are trying to convince Ukraine about something which already failed in the European Union.
Another advice is, of course, a large privatization, which little by little takes place, though a number of very important assets, state assets, are not still privatized. At the same time, some of them, some industries or some spheres, like if we speak about energy, I'm not speaking about the oil and gas, but for instance, electricity, they're already privatized.
Exactly. Like Carnegie just published an energy reform review when one of the theses is like that, you know, our experts were not sure that privatization, for example, for the energy, particularly the power generation, is a policy solution at all, since most of it was already in the private hands, and unfortunately, is a monopoly, or DTEC, Rinat Akhmetov DTEC is in a very heavily monopolistic solution. So that is what I'm trying to say, that, you know, like in many ways we're trying to ascribe or prescribe a dogmatic or general policy prescription into a very local situation, and we should be a little bit more flexible, which by the way, I think the IMF and the Western institutions, by the way, trying to do.
And how the situation is unique for Ukraine compared to its eastern neighbors, also who went through the reforms. Sometimes these reforms are compared. Sometimes we can even discuss if it's eligible to compare the reforms of early 90s, before the crisis, with different EU, with non-oligarchic economy yet, with what's going on in Ukraine. And you have the strong knowledge of the region.
I think, I mean, you know, like, I think what we're trying to compare the situation, we shouldn't compare really to the 90s, because Ukraine already going through their 90s, which was similar to Russia, very wild privatization, you know, the oligarchization of the society and politics, and Ukraine. This is still one of the key weaknesses. What Ukraine doesn't have vis-a-vis, for example, Russia is a very pluralistic, you know, still democratic society, as well as there is a huge competition, which ensures, you know, among political parties, which ensure competition. I think we can compare Ukraine vis-a-vis, you know, Central and Eastern European neighbors, which are, meaning the Western neighbors of Ukraine, which are much more, you know, because this is exactly where the countries where the heavy FDI came in after the shock therapy, when it comes to Slovakia, when it comes to Hungary, when it comes to Poland or the Czech Republic. What we see there, though, there is a backlash against the foreign direct investment, particularly because the convergence with the Western Europe, with the Western Europe part of the European Union has stopped in 2008, after 2008 and 2009, particularly when it comes to the wages. For example, the Czechs or the Slovaks have 1/3 of the German wages. And, you know, the Czechs and the Slovaks are not comparing that to Ukraine. They're comparing it to Germany. So there is a feeling, and this is what explains, you know, the regressive politics of Viktor Orbán in Hungary, or, for example, Kaczynski in PiS, which is turning against Western Europe a little bit, which are saying, you know, the economic solutions which you guys were preaching us were not really working for everyone in the society. So that is the East-West divide which we are seeing there.
We can say that economy is about figures, but it's so much about feelings as well. And another notions which always pumps up, of course, in case of Ukraine, but today globally, and of course in Eastern Europe, it's anti-corruption fight. We discussed with you earlier that according to the recent Eurobarometer corruption survey, nearly 8 in 10 Europeans agree that there are two close links between business and politics in their country. So this is a pretty high percentage for the whole continent. At the same time, I would be very concerned that anti-corruption fight is becoming politicized, though speaking about this, it's also a slippery slope, because that's how the corruption apologists treating that issue. So we hear these notions from the Western allies, not just, and also anti-corruption activists and political forces here in Ukraine. How would you really think we should treat that? Also bearing in mind the experience of our neighbors.
Yeah, first of all, I think when it comes to the corruption, and I think even the Western institutions would agree with that the corruption has been, the situation around corruption has been improving. Not only because of the anti-corruption institutions, which are very important, but first of all, you're seeing the actual corruption experience going down. I can fully confirm, I used to live here for long years. You know, I was exposed to corruption, you know, in various institutions, Ukrainian institutions, which is no longer exist. The police, the hospitals, the border guards, you know, these are, so the actual situation has been improving, and you're saying that the corruption experience of Ukrainian people is going down. What is not moving is the perception. The perception is extremely high, but it's very interestingly very similar to Central Europe. You know, like the actual corruption experience in Central Europe is now, for example, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, is around 6-7%. Right? In Ukraine, it's higher, it's around 20-25%. But it's going down already, decreasing tendency. Now, in Slovakia or the Czech Republic, the actual corruption perception is over 90%. How you can explain this huge difference, right? And one of the explanation is that, exactly as you're saying, that the corruption, the anti-corruption, is over-politicized because, you know, A, the Western institutions or the European institutions are putting a lot of emphasis that, and B, because really the national elites are remaining corrupt in these countries as well. So this is a relevant issue. But at the same time, there is also a growing gap between the elites and the rest of the people. So the politics is where the actual corruption is happening in Central and Eastern Europe, including, for example, Ukraine. At the same time, the actual corruption experience by the institutional level because of the anti-corruption is going down. Now, the other thing, the other factor which I think is important is conflating between corruption and competence. And when you're digging yourself into the surveys, then you're seeing when people are listing, right, the actual reason for corruption, then it comes to the competence of the authorities, and it comes to actually the figure, which is astonishing, that people see business and government relations to close, which is the #1 reason of the corruption. So across the European Union, not only in Ukraine, people see state capture at the highest level.
At the same time, in particular in Eastern Europe, we have the birth of the anti-corruption institution. We have them in some of the Baltic states. We had a very interesting case in Romania where, it had taken them years to build the anti-corruption bodies, and they had become successful, yet politicized as well, but sometimes some people would bring it as an example for Ukraine. So what are your concerns about that? And also, there is a huge hope on the anti-corruption bodies here, as probably not because they're named like that, but in particular because they are brand new institutions which are created from the scratch compared to the institutions we have inherited, where people really don't believe it's possible to get rid of this something which had been there for decades. So how would you assess this thing in Ukraine, but also in other countries? And you don't have these institutions in the older Western European states.
Exactly. We have in Slovakia, for example, and I used to use this example that it took almost 15 years for the so-called special court which was set up for corruption in Slovakia to actually put in jail the first high level, at the ministerial level.
15 years.
15 years. So I think, but it's very important that the institutions itself, and the IMF representative was talking about integrity, it is bringing the necessary accountability, integrity, a check and balances, separation of powers into the heavily top-down Ukrainian governance system. So I think it's terribly important. At the same time, particularly the experience of Central Europe, and there's a huge scandal in Romania by now that the anti-corruption authorities, which are very independent, right, they're putting one politician after another into jail, probably for a good reason, but now the entire political class is thinking, and not only in Romania, but in Central and Eastern Europe, that maybe, who these institutions are accountable to the European Union, or where? Because they're not accountable to anyone they're not elected, right? So the democratic mandate of these institutions actually coming into the limelight, which is a very interesting, it's a kind of backlash of the political class, which has to go through democratic elections, investing into this, and they're seeing emerging institutions which are, suddenly coming. They're very strong. They have even sometimes public support, but they never elected. So the question of democratic legitimacy came into the time, and the actual Romanian anti-corruption scandal is connected to the accusations, and so far these accusations seems to be confirmed, that the anti-corruption agencies, because of under the urgency of delivering results, were secretly cooperating with the secret services to put pressure on those who they wanted to convict. So the issue is how much they, again, the objectives are eating the intentions are eating the objective in this particular case.
I should say Ukrainians are very curious about that and looking into those details also not to make the same mistakes. And Balazs, thanks so much for an interesting conversation. And that was Balazs Jarabik, who is the non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'll be back in a second.